On the morning of October 16th, 1962, the United States discovered something that, by Cold War logic, left no room for hesitation. American U-2 reconnaissance photos confirmed that the Soviet Union was installing nuclear missile sites in Cuba. Not prototypes, not plans, operational launch facilities, less than 150 kilometers from Florida. In strategic terms, this was the nightmare scenario every Cold War doctrine had warned about. Soviet nuclear missiles placed within striking distance of major U.S. cities. Flight times measured in minutes. No margin for error. There was an expected response to discoveries like this. Strike first. Destroy the sites. Remove the threat before it could be used. That response was not controversial. It was standard. Inside the Pentagon, many senior military leaders believed the only rational move was an immediate airstrike, followed by a full invasion of Cuba, if necessary. Delay, they argued, would only increase the risk. Once those missiles became fully operational, the balance of nuclear power would tilt overnight. And yet, something unexpected happened. The strike order did not come. Instead, the man with the authority to launch it, John F. Kennedy, paused. That pause is the reason this story matters. Because what followed was not a debate about whether the United States should act, but how much destruction it was willing to risk triggering in the process. Kennedy was not facing a theoretical problem. This was not a simulation or a war game. Every option on the table carried consequences that could not be undone. A bombing campaign might eliminate the missiles, but it would almost certainly kill Soviet personnel. And once Soviet blood was spilled, retaliation was no longer a possibility. It was an expectation. At the same time, doing nothing was politically impossible. The missiles existed. The photos were real. If the United States failed to respond, allies would question American credibility, and adversaries would test its resolve elsewhere. The Cold War had reached a moment where strength and restraint were pulling in opposite directions. This was not just about Cuba, or even about the Soviet Union. It was about whether nuclear deterrence could survive its first true stress test. What most people remember about the Cuban Missile Crisis is how it ended. Fewer remember how close it came to spiraling out of control, or how unconventional the first major decision actually was. Because when Kennedy finally addressed the nation days later, he did not announce an attack. He announced a blockade, a naval quarantine of Cuba. No bombs, no invasion, no immediate destruction of the missile sites. To many observers at the time, this looked like hesitation. To some within his own government, it looked like weakness. But in reality, it was something far more dangerous, a calculated attempt to hold the line without crossing the point of no return. This video is about that decision. Not the speeches, not the slogans, not the simplified version history textbooks often tell. It is about the hours after the photos arrived. The pressure inside closed rooms. The warnings that were raised, and the assumptions that nearly overruled them. And most importantly, it is about why choosing not to strike may have been the most consequential act of command in the entire Cold War. Because once the first bomb falls, control ends. And in October 1962, control was the only thing standing between the world and nuclear war. By the afternoon of October 16, 1962, the problem was no longer intelligence. The evidence was conclusive. The missiles were real. The construction sites were active. And within days, possibly hours, those weapons could be operational. The real battle began inside closed rooms. John F. Kennedy convened a small, tightly controlled group of advisors that would later be known as the Executive Committee of the National Security Council, EXCOM. Its purpose was simple: determine how the United States would respond before the situation forced its hand. What followed was not calm deliberation. It was pressure from every direction. The military case for an immediate strike was blunt and uncompromising. Air Force planners argued that a coordinated bombing campaign could destroy most, if not all, of the missile sites before they became operational. If any survived, a full invasion of Cuba would follow. From a purely tactical standpoint, this was the cleanest solution. Delay, they warned, meant surrendering initiative. But Kennedy was not weighing tactics alone. Politically, he was already vulnerable. Just a year earlier, the Bay of Pigs invasion had collapsed into humiliation. His opponents questioned his judgment. Some doubted his resolve. Others believed the Soviet leadership was actively testing him, pushing closer to the brink precisely because they sensed weakness. Backing down was not an option. Yet escalation carried its own dangers. An airstrike would almost certainly kill Soviet personnel stationed at the missile sites. That fact changed everything. Once American bombs killed Soviet soldiers, the crisis would no longer be confined to Cuba. Moscow would be under intense pressure to respond, somewhere, somehow. Berlin was an obvious flashpoint. So was Turkey, or a naval confrontation elsewhere. The Cold War was not a single battlefield. It was a global web of pressure points, and striking one risked igniting several at once. Kennedy understood something that the operational plans did not account for. Once the first move was made, the next steps would no longer be his to control. Inside XCOM, this concern was not universally shared. Many advisors believed nuclear war, while catastrophic, could be managed through decisive action. The assumption was that strength would deter retaliation, that Moscow, when faced with overwhelming force, would ultimately back down. Kennedy was not convinced. He had spent months studying the logic of nuclear deterrence. He knew that it depended on rational actors making restrained choices under extreme stress. But he also knew history was filled with leaders who believed they could control events, right up until they couldn't. The pressure intensified as time passed. Every hour that construction continued in Cuba made an attack riskier. The longer the United States waited, the more dangerous an action appeared. Yet the faster it moved, the greater the chance of triggering a chain reaction no one could stop. This was the paradox Kennedy faced. Act too soon and risk nuclear war. Wait too long and risk losing control altogether. There was no safe option, only degrees of danger. What made the moment even more volatile was secrecy. The public did not yet know about the missiles. Allies were unaware. Congress was in the dark. Kennedy was making one of the most consequential decisions in modern history without public mandate, under intense scrutiny and against the ticking clock of an adversary whose next move was unknown. In that pressure cooker, restraint looked increasingly fragile. Yet Kennedy continued to resist the call for immediate strikes. Not because he believed the missiles were acceptable, but because he believed the consequences of destroying them might be worse than the threat they posed. This was not indecision. It was a deliberate refusal to let military logic alone dictate the outcome. And that refusal would soon place him at odds with some of the most powerful institutions in the United States government, at the exact moment when unity seemed most necessary. The next phase of the crisis would reveal just how close those warnings came to being overruled, and how narrow the path to disaster truly was. As XCOM debates intensified, the conversation began to narrow around a dangerous assumption, that a limited strike could remain limited. Several warnings challenged that belief. They did not come from idealists. They came from intelligence assessments, diplomatic experience, and hard lessons learned during earlier Cold War confrontations. One warning was straightforward. There was no guarantee that an airstrike would eliminate every missile site. The U-2 photographs showed multiple locations, but intelligence coverage was incomplete. Some sites were still under construction. Others might already be operational. A strike that missed even a single nuclear-capable system would leave the United States exposed after it had already initiated hostilities. Another warning cut deeper. Any attack on Cuba would almost certainly kill Soviet personnel. These were not Cuban-operated systems. Soviet officers were on the ground, overseeing construction and security. Their deaths would not be a footnote. They would be a political fact Moscow could not ignore. Several advisors pointed out what the military plans avoided saying out loud. Once Soviet soldiers were killed by American bombs, the crisis would no longer be about Cuba. It would become a direct U.S. Soviet confrontation. There were also warnings about escalation speed. The Cold War had created a world where decisions could outpace diplomacy. A strike launched in the morning could provoke retaliation before diplomats even reached the phone. The idea that leaders could pause, reassess, and de-escalate after the first blow was increasingly seen as unrealistic. These warnings were real. They were recorded, and they were discussed, but they were not dominant. Why? Because they conflicted with the prevailing logic of deterrence. Many military planners believed that failing to strike decisively would invite further provocation, not just in Cuba, but everywhere. If the Soviet Union learned it could place nuclear weapons near U.S. territory without immediate consequences, the entire balance of power would shift. Strength, they argued, was clarity. Anything less was ambiguity, and ambiguity was dangerous. There was also a powerful institutional bias at work. Operational plans existed for airstrikes and invasion. They had been prepared, refined, and rehearsed. There were no equivalent playbooks for restraint, no doctrine for how to apply pressure without crossing the threshold into war. In that environment, warnings sounded abstract. Action sounded concrete. John F. Kennedy listened to both sides, but he kept returning to the same concern. Once the United States struck, it would lose control over how the crisis unfolded. He asked questions that unsettled the room. What if the Soviets responded in Berlin? What if a naval incident spiraled out of control? What if nuclear weapons were used, not by design, but by miscalculation? These were not theoretical risks. They were inherent features of the system both superpowers had built. Yet even as these dangers were acknowledged, momentum continued to build toward military action. Time pressure favored decisiveness. Uncertainty favored force. And the longer the debate lasted, the more some advisors feared that hesitation itself would become the greatest risk of all. By the end of these discussions, the warnings had not disappeared. They had simply been pushed to the margins. The crisis was now approaching the point where debate would give way to execution, and the next decision would determine whether those warnings were finally heeded or permanently silenced. By October 20th, 1962, the window for deliberation was closing. Construction in Cuba continued. Intelligence updates arrived daily. And the longer the United States waited, the more any future action risked colliding with an operational nuclear force. Inside XCOM, the debate narrowed to two paths. One led forward, toward air strikes and invasion. The other ran parallel to war, applying pressure without crossing the line that would make escalation automatic. That second path had a name: a naval blockade. It was not the preferred option of most military planners. A blockade did not remove the missiles. It did not punish the Soviet Union immediately, and it carried its own risks, particularly at sea, where misunderstandings could turn lethal within minutes. But it offered something no strike could: time. Time to signal resolve without firing the first shot. Time to test Moscow's intentions. Time to keep the next move from being irreversible. On October 22nd, 1962, John F. Kennedy made his decision public. In a televised address to the nation, he revealed the existence of the missiles and announced a quarantine of Cuba, carefully avoiding the word blockade, which carried legal implications of war. U.S. naval forces would intercept and inspect Soviet ships heading toward the island. Any vessel carrying offensive weapons would be turned back. The message was calibrated with precision. The United States was not attacking, but it was not backing down. Behind the scenes, the machinery of escalation was already in motion. U.S. forces worldwide moved to higher alert levels. Strategic bombers were dispersed. Missile crews prepared for rapid launch. The blockade line was drawn across the Caribbean, and naval commanders were given rules of engagement designed to prevent accidental combat, while still enforcing the quarantine. This was restraint, but it was armed restraint. Every element of the decision acknowledged a dangerous truth. Once the first shot was fired, no one could guarantee where the crisis would end. Kennedy's choice did not remove that danger. It managed it barely. The blockade was not a solution. It was a holding action. And now the success of that decision depended on something no American plan could fully control: how the Soviet Union would respond. If Soviet ships challenged the quarantine, U.S. commanders would be forced to act. If a confrontation at sea turned violent, the careful line Kennedy had drawn would disappear in an instant. The decision had been executed. Now, it would be tested hour by hour on open water, with nuclear war waiting on the other side of a single mistake. The moment the quarantine line went into effect, the crisis shifted from conference rooms to open water. This was no longer a theoretical debate. It was a live test of restraint, played out ship by ship, hour by hour. Within days of the October 22nd announcement, U.S. naval forces were positioned across the Caribbean. Destroyers and aircraft carriers formed a moving barrier designed to intercept Soviet vessels before they reached Cuba. Orders were explicit: stop the ships, inspect them, and turn them back if necessary, but avoid firing unless absolutely unavoidable. At the same time, the stakes quietly escalated. On October 24th, U.S. military forces moved to DEFCON 2, the highest alert level ever reached during the Cold War. Strategic bombers were airborne around the clock. Missile crews stood ready. The entire nuclear command structure was primed for rapid response. Publicly, the United States spoke of quarantine and diplomacy. Privately, it prepared for the possibility that diplomacy would fail. The most dangerous hours came as Soviet ships approached the quarantine line. Some slowed, some changed course, others continued forward. Each radar contact raised the same question: would this be the ship that forced a confrontation? A single misjudgment, an aggressive maneuver, a misunderstood signal, a nervous commander could trigger violence. And once violence began, escalation would be swift. At sea, there was no room for delay. If a Soviet ship refused inspection, U.S. commanders would have seconds to decide whether to board, disable, or fire. Any exchange of force, however limited, risked transforming the blockade into open conflict. Meanwhile, pressure intensified on both sides. In Washington, advisors watched the maps in near silence, aware that events were now unfolding beyond the reach of careful language. In Moscow, Soviet leadership faced its own dilemma: challenge the quarantine and risk war, or pull back and appear to concede under pressure. The quarantine's greatest danger was also its greatest strength. It forced decisions without immediately destroying anything. But it also placed human judgment at the center of a nuclear standoff, at the lowest operational levels. Pilots, ship captains, sonar operators, men who had not designed nuclear strategy were now responsible for keeping it from collapsing. As the hours passed, several Soviet vessels altered course or stopped short of the quarantine line. The immediate collision Kennedy had feared did not occur, but the relief was fragile. Because the missiles were still in Cuba, the blockade had not removed them. It had merely frozen the situation at its most volatile point. The crisis now entered its most unstable phase, a standoff where both sides were armed, alert, and waiting for the other to blink, knowing that if neither did, the consequences would be irreversible. This was the cost of restraint. No explosions, no clear victory, only sustained tension, with nuclear war no longer hypothetical, but conditional. And the conditions were narrowing fast. When the immediate danger began to ease, the relief was quiet and incomplete. The missiles would eventually be removed from Cuba, but the crisis left behind something more lasting than a diplomatic outcome. It permanently altered how both superpowers understood nuclear confrontation. For John F. Kennedy, the blockade was not remembered as a show of force, but as proof of how little margin for error actually existed. The crisis exposed a flaw at the heart of Cold War strategy. Deterrence assumed rational control, yet real events moved faster than leaders could reliably manage. In the months that followed, this realization reshaped policy. One of the first changes was communication. During the crisis, messages between Washington and Moscow had taken hours, sometimes longer, to arrive, be translated, and be interpreted. In a standoff measured in minutes, that delay was dangerous. The solution was direct, permanent contact. The Washington-Moscow hotline was established not as a symbol of cooperation, but as an emergency brake, something to be used when everything else failed. Strategic thinking shifted as well. Military planners on both sides began to acknowledge that escalation was not always deliberate. It could be accidental, misread radar signals, overconfident commanders, local decisions made under stress. The Cuban Missile Crisis demonstrated that once forces were fully mobilized, political control weakened rapidly. This understanding fed into later arms control efforts. Agreements limiting nuclear tests, improving verification, and managing crises were no longer seen as idealistic gestures. They were practical responses to a system that had come dangerously close to collapsing under its own weight. Yet the irony remained. The blockade worked not because it removed risk, but because it redistributed it. Instead of a sudden explosion of violence, the danger was stretched out over days, forcing both sides to confront the consequences of each incremental move. That approach would influence future crises, from Berlin to the Middle East, where leaders increasingly sought ways to signal resolve without triggering automatic retaliation. But none of those later moments erased the core lesson of October 1962. Nuclear war had not been avoided by superior planning. It had been avoided by restraint, uncertainty, and a decision to slow events down when speed seemed inevitable. And even that solution came with a cost, one that would only become fully visible years later, when classified records began to surface and the true proximity of disaster was finally understood. For years after the crisis ended, the public believed the danger had been contained. The missiles were removed. The standoff passed. History recorded the episode as a tense but ultimately controlled confrontation between rational leaders. That version was incomplete, as Cold War archives were gradually declassified, first in fragments, then in fuller detail. A far more disturbing picture emerged. It became clear that the United States had underestimated how advanced the Soviet deployment in Cuba actually was. Some of the missiles were closer to operational readiness than Washington had believed. Even more alarming, tactical nuclear weapons were already on the island, systems never mentioned in public discussions at the time. Those weapons fell outside the scenarios XCOM had debated. They meant that an invasion of Cuba, had it followed an airstrike, could have triggered nuclear use on the battlefield, without authorization from Moscow. Local commanders, under attack, might have had both the capability and the incentive to respond immediately. The margin Kennedy thought he may have been far thinner. Other revelations followed. Soviet submarine crews operating near the quarantine line were under extreme stress, cut off from clear communication, unsure whether war had already begun. In at least one case, nuclear arms systems were nearly activated based on incomplete information and escalating pressure. These were not abstract dangers. They were moments where individual judgment, not presidential authority, stood between restraint and catastrophe. Years later, even senior officials on both sides admitted how little they had known at the time. Decisions had been made using partial information, optimistic assumptions, and faith in systems that were far less stable than advertised. The Cold War had always been presented as a chess match between capitals. The truth was messier. It was a chain of human decisions made under uncertainty, many of them invisible, many of them dangerously close to failure. The Cuban Missile Crisis did not just reveal how leaders managed nuclear weapons. It revealed how much of humanity's survival depended on information that arrived late, warnings that were discounted, and people who chose not to act when action seemed expected. And that realization set the stage for the final irony of the story, one that challenges how this crisis is remembered at all. The Cuban Missile Crisis is often remembered as a victory of leadership, a test of resolve, a moment where diplomacy prevailed, a crisis that ended cleanly, with missiles removed and war avoided. But that memory smooths over the most unsettling truth. The system did not save the world. It almost destroyed it. What prevented nuclear war in October 1962 was not a flawless chain of command or perfectly calculated deterrence. It was hesitation, friction, human doubt, decisions that slowed events down when momentum was pushing toward violence. Kennedy's blockade is remembered because it worked. What is less comfortable to remember is why it had to work. Because the alternatives were irreversible. An airstrike would have looked decisive. An invasion would have looked strong. Both would likely have crossed a line that no speech, no negotiation, and no back channel could undo. The irony of the Cold War is that its most dangerous moments were created by systems designed to prevent war, and resolved only when individuals stepped outside their expected roles. The blockade did not eliminate risk. It redistributed it onto human judgment, onto ship captains who chose caution, onto commanders who waited instead of firing, onto leaders who accepted uncertainty instead of control. That is the uncomfortable legacy of this crisis. The world did not survive because nuclear strategy worked as planned. It survived because, at one critical moment, a leader refused to do what everyone expected him to do. And that refusal bought time. Not safety, not certainty, just time. Enough time for the pressure to ease. Enough time for disaster to step back from the edge. In the Cold War, history did not survive because it was secure. It survived by chance. In October 1962 was the moment when that chance was nearly lost. And this was not the last time the Cold War came this close. In this crisis, the world survived because one decision slowed everything down, just enough to keep control from collapsing. But what if the danger didn't come from a real attack at all? What if the next near catastrophe was triggered by something both sides believed was harmless? In the next episode, we'll uncover how a routine NATO military exercise was misread as the opening move of a real war, and how that misunderstanding nearly triggered World War III. Looking back at October 1962, do you think the blockade was the right choice? Or would a strike have been inevitable? Share your thoughts in the comments. And subscribe to Cold War Command to follow this series of moments when the Cold War nearly became something far worse.